very honored to be here. I also want to say a huge thank to the hard work and the vision of the Jaipur Festival organizers, and also this beautiful, it's probably one of the most beautiful public libraries, probably maybe in the US, but definitely in the Southwest for sure. So it's a huge honor to be here and to share some of our, talk a little bit about our works, our concerns, and I'll be introducing our two outstanding faculty that are at CU Boulder, and they're already making a huge wave in terms of academic leadership and doing really cutting edge work. So can you hear me now? Yeah? All right, cool. Sorry. Cool. So, as a couple prefatory comments, and then I'll do a formal introduction. 2019 is a very, and I'm being somewhat sarcastic, a very interesting time to be Mexican or Latinx, and also to be teaching Latinx studies. We're arguably living in absolutely horrifying times of exalted state and vigilante violence, and exalted acts and performances of kind of toxic masculinity at the highest levels of power, and this kind of seeming impunity with which entitlement, sexual violence, gender-based violence, patriarchy, white male supremacy, and so on and so forth, seem to be really at a very dominant and very profound performance representation with a huge range of repercussions. The vigilante shootings, the war on children, the majority of children that Trump has enacted war on, many are indigenous, whose first languages are not Spanish. Many are fleeing pretty extreme types of violence in many cases. We won't have really time to talk in depth about it, but in many cases actually byproducts or direct results of US policies of deportation and criminalization of youth. The Mara Salvatrucha, it's a very prominent transnational gang, has its origins in kind of US foreign policy and also immigration policy, which no one ever really talks about. So we're living in very horrifying times. The majority of Latinx folks in the United States are living in very high levels of anxiety and fear. I work a lot with the Latino History Project. It used to be called the Boulder County Latino History Project, and we work with middle school, high school, elementary school teachers and trying to bring culturally relevant pedagogy materials and try to find ways to teach about Latino history and culture, Latinx history and culture in Colorado, the Southwest. And so I hear this constantly from the teachers that we work with, that kids are just really anxious, and they're having hard times concentrating. A lot of the children are very afraid that they're gonna go home, their parents aren't gonna be there, and now people are even afraid to kind of go into public spaces. And so this is very scary times to be Latino and also to do the kind of work that we do. I don't know if you can perhaps put that slide up, sir, if that's okay. Right. Cool. So I just came up with a quick slide just to kind of, I guess, capstone a little bit or kind of frame a little bit some of my prefatory comments, and then I'm going to hand it over and let our phenomenal faculty talk about their cutting edge and important work and how they're seeing kind of the politics of the life that we're living today. It seems that so much of Trump's rise to political power and his desire to, take another term in office is very much grounded in this idea of creating this idea of the invader, the other, demonizing, criminalizing the other. For those who are kind of shocked by the discourse, by the practices and policies of otherization, you can actually find its histories into the 1850s and the birth of nativism here in the United States. If you wouldn't mind going to the second slide, sir, if that's okay. I appreciate that, thank you. The birth of nativism here in the United States actually began by this full-scale criminalization of Irish Catholic immigrants that were fleeing the potato famine and this ongoing colonial arguably kind of violence with the English nation state as they're arriving into New York City. And so it's really interesting hearing a lot of Trump's speeches. You can almost quote the similar types of speeches of nativist candidates in the mid-19th century. You can almost take word for word some of the political speeches that got people elected in office by demonizing the other to somehow then create this idea that I'm going to lead and provide safety and opportunities for you if you're not part of this otherized community. So yeah, when I first came across nativism, I saw, a Native American party, and I thought, oh wow, it's cool, all these indigenous nations are organizing and trying to enter into the democratic political process to fight for their collective rights and withstand the onslaughts of settler colonialism, genocide, displacement, creation of treaties and so on and so forth. But in fact, it was a party about protecting the rights of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant men by demonizing and otherizing everyone who wasn't. So in the sense that America, with a capital A, only belongs to WAPS men. So anyway, I'll stop now, and I'm going to go ahead and do a formal presentation of the bio, and then have Dr. Avalos talk about her really cutting-edge work. So Dr. Natalie Avalos is currently in the second year of the Chancellor's Postdoctoral Fellowship Program at the University of Colorado Boulder. It's the most prestigious and most difficult fellowship, I think, to get in the country. It has like a 2% or 4% acceptance rates. We're really honored that Dr. Avalos is there, and as Dr. Avalos finishes her second year of the postdoc, she's gonna hit the ground running, and already kind of has, to start as a tenure track professor in the Department of Ethnic Studies. Dr. Avalos is already teaching one of our really important graduate seminars. Let me say something about her book and her interests. So Dr. Avalos is very interested in indigenous religions, diaspora, healing strategies, and ways to resist the kind of violence of colonization and what people call the coloniality of power. Dr. Avalos is currently working on a book manuscript called The Metaphysics of Decoloniality, Transnational Indigeneities and Religious Refusal. Dr. Avalos is of Apache descent. So let's go ahead and give a huge round of applause to Dr. Avalos, and then I'll introduce Dr. Soares shortly. So.
Thank you, Arturo. Can you guys hear me? Okay, so first of all, I want to thank the JLF for reaching out to Kristie, Arturo, and I for this panel, because I think it's very rare to have this kind of conversation in Boulder. And I was a little surprised that they'd be interested to hear what we had to say, what our experiences, why they might be relevant here. And so, as Arturo noted, my work centers on indigeneity. I'm a Chicana of Apache descent, meaning that I have a Apache grandmother and great-grandmother. So my father is from New Mexico. I grew up in the Bay Area. My mom is from Mexico. And so my interest in indigeneity as someone that is also Chicana, Latina, Latinx, is that I was confused by the category Latino or even Chicano as a young person. I couldn't figure out how is it that it relates to larger Native nations and Native identities. And I realized that the category itself is more of a, like Mexican is a national category, and it aligns or it transforms some of the many racial categories that exist throughout Latin America. So in Latin America, you have folks that are indigenous, you have folks that are descendants of African slaves, you have Iberian folks, and they're coexisting, but with very different politics between them. And so my work seeks to understand how in the Southwest, so my fieldwork was in New Mexico, but now that I'm here in Colorado, I realize that the Southwest this is part of that frontier. There's a cultural continuity from that Spanish colonial period up into this place. How it is that urban Indians are negotiating religious revitalization, reclaiming their indigenous lifeways, their metaphysical worlds. And as I was doing this work, I realized that these metaphysical worlds have never left them. They've continued. And part of what my work tries to dispel and disrupt is that people of Latino descent in these places that are oftentimes mixed Native and Iberian, although many have been detribalized, they still continue to negotiate these Native lifeways even if they are not members of tribes. And so trying to understand how it is that this population of people is working in solidarity with and really in parallel ways for decolonization and self-determination along with other Native nations. Another component of my work that's a little unique is that I was really interested in trying to understand how the kind of settler colonialism that takes place in the US and has really impacted all of the Americas plays out in other parts of the world. So my work compares urban Indian experience with Tibetan refugee experience. And one of the reasons why I was interested was because as a young person, I became a Tibetan Buddhist. And as I got to learn more about Tibetan history, as someone of Native descent, I kept recognizing it, not in a positive way, recognizing the forms of settler colonial dispossession, the criminalization of religion, racialization that took place in the US, and how it was mapped on, how it was essentially borrowed and mapped on to Tibetans. So my work really seeks to understand how settler colonialisms replicate, how they operate as one long and joining system internationally, how they currently support nationalisms around the world. And really, in context of this panel, what I'd like to discuss and will unpack further is how specifically anti-Mexican sentiment along the US border has a deep, long history, as Arturo started to note for us. It's attached to anti-Indigenous sentiment. If we think of the settler colonial project as not one single event, settler colonial theory helps us understand it as an ongoing project that has to perpetuate over time. And so you have to continue settling nations by discourses of security, securing borders, criminalizing the indigenous foreign contagion. How do you make the indigenous foreign? Well, through racialization. So I'd like Kristie to have an opportunity to share a little bit about her work, and then we can continue talking about this.
Be good and introduce you, Dr. Soares, if that's okay. So, really fortunate to have Dr. Kristie Soares here, an assistant professor in the Department of Women and Gender Studies, and affiliate in our Department of Ethnic Studies. I used to be able to memorize all this stuff when I was about 10 years younger. Now I'm getting a little older, so I have to read stuff. I apologize. So, Dr. Soares is also, in addition to a phenomenal cutting-edge scholar of media, popular culture, film, literature, music, is also a performance artist, and that looks at issues of the performativity of queerness, especially in the Latinx communities, or from a Latinx kind of epistemic or community space. So Dr. Soares' research focuses on 19th to 21st century Latinx literature and media, with a specific focus on queer Caribeño or Caribbean cultural production. It's really awesome that you're here, and hopefully by some of Dr. Soares' work, you might get a deeper understanding of how complex and, overlapping and at the same time complex the different kind of positionalities of Mexican indigenous, Caribeño, Puerto Rican, Cuban, and Dominican, and so on and so forth. Dr. Soares' current book project, phenomenal title, by the way, Salsa Epistemology. Wow, that's amazing. Engages with salsa, the music and dance tradition, to show how embodied playfulness figures as an integral part of queer activism in the Spanish Caribbean diaspora. And then your Dr. Soares' own performance work is about making political statements and using the body as a site of resistance, agency, and empowerment. Dr. Soares' most recent performance project is a play that Dr. Soares co-wrote with her writing partner, Caterina Ruiz, entitled Arroz con Mango. So if you're not hungry after hearing that, arroz con mango basically, it's, rice with mango, yummy, yummy. The play offers a humorous but poignant depiction of growing up queer in Cuban and Miami. So, Dr. Soares, let's give a huge round of applause to Dr. Soares.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Arturo and Natalie. Thank you for the organizers for having us. Natalie, as you said, I think what's unique about this opportunity is to be able to discuss how global capitalism works and how it has worked in our various sites of study in suspiciously similar ways. So in some ways, the Latinx moment that we're living right now in the US is particular, and in other ways it really is not. My work is on the Caribbean, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Dominican Republic, both the islands and the diasporic communities in the US. In particular, right now, I'm looking at discourses of anti-Blackness in the Dominican Republic, which have a lot to do with what is going on in the US-Mexico border right now. In short, there is a systematic push by the government of the Dominican Republic to deterritorialize Black Dominicans, who are framed in this case as Dominicans of Haitian descent, which is not a particularly useful category because the histories and in fact the border between the Dominican Republic and Haiti have moved many, many times in the last 200 years. So to say that someone is of Haitian descent is not a useful designation, as the Dominican-Haitian border does not separate Blackness from non-Blackness in any way. So what we're seeing now in the Dominican Republic is a push to strip Dominicans, quote unquote, of Haitian descent of citizenship rights by invalidating their papers, their birth certificates, or some people, of course, in the countryside in particular, the border between Haiti and the Dominican Republic is in many places quite rural and quite poor. Some people don't have birth certificates. So this push to say, if you're Black, you're not Dominican, I think has a lot of similarities to this push to say, if you are what I read as Mexican or what I read as other, you cannot also be American. We're also seeing similar things, have been seeing similar things in Puerto Rico. I'm sure many of you are aware, Puerto Rico has been for a long time and is at this moment in particular in a state of crisis because of many things, among them Hurricane Maria, but even preceding that, a huge amount of debt that the state of Puerto Rico is in that it cannot pay off because of its colonial status of belonging to the US. Meaning that Puerto Rico cannot, as an independent nation, could, say, refinance loans, ask for forgiveness, this sort of thing. So what we see is Puerto Rico in a neo-colonial state, and the way that this kind of plays out on the ground, similar to these nativist discourses, is this finger pointing. Who is it that is really Puerto Rican? Who is to blame for this? And as we might imagine, in the Caribbean in particular, it's often discourses of anti-Blackness. So who does and does not get to be Puerto Rican, who does and does not get to belong. And this is, of course, within the state of Puerto Rico, which is Puerto Ricans are US citizens. So even within that. The other work I do is on Cuba. Right now we had, last week I believe it was, a plane load of 150 Cubans being returned to Cuba after crossing the border and seeking asylum. Cubans have long received protected status by the US government. They have long received what we would call model minority status within the Latinx community, long received benefits from government grants, from US residency upon arrival to the US, rather than having to go through a process of applying, say, for a green card in the same way that another migrant would. And under the Trump administration, we're seeing a lot of those protections eroded. And I think what we can learn from that is that if Cubans, with all of the history of the Cuban Missile Crisis and JFK and the sort of boogeyman that Cuban communism has been in the US imaginary for 60 years, with all of that, if Cubans, the model minorities of the Latinx population, are now constituting one of the largest groups asking for asylum and being denied on the border, then things are really bad for everyone else. And I myself am Cuban. I grew up Cuban and Brazilian in Miami. So I'm interested in seeing how global power works and the ways that we can relate this to other situations in the world. There are, I think, really fruitful parallels to be drawn between the border of the US right now and Palestine, the border of the US right now in Kashmir. I think that global power is working systematically in similar ways, and at this moment, perhaps the best thing that we can do to support Latinx people in the US is to work on the micro, of course, support people, but also on the macro, because in some ways these power structures were turned against the Irish, they're turned against Latinx people, and 100 years from now it'll be another group. But if the power structures are left intact, and I think that's where our fields are going, then our activism for any particular group is not useful. Our activism against a global power structure, I think, is more useful. So I'd love to discuss that.
Amazing introductory comments. I guess I have a question to both of you, and we could just kind of have a discussion, and hopefully in the audience Q&A or discussion, perhaps we can go a little deeper into things. So, so Dr. Soares, Kristie, I was very, really took seriously what you were saying about anti-Black racism, right, in the Caribe, right? And so it kind of made me think a little bit as a way to perhaps tie both of your kind of research projects and kind of tie some themes here in today's discussion, is what do you see, and this is for both of you, as the kind of imperatives of decolonization? Do you think this anti-Black racism is a result of the 500 plus years of colonization and the demonization of people stolen from West Africa and forced into states of enslavement, and this kind of Eurocentrism, which is very dominant in Mexico and in the Caribe, where people are taught to really devalue themselves as African or indigenous or African and indigenous and try to value, or mimic or, this kind of Eurocentric norms, right? And so I'm wondering, if in terms of both of your projects, how you see decolonization playing out. And then, of course, a sub-theme that's as important is also thinking about what the decolonization of gender means. The reason I mention that is prior to colonization, most indigenous communities and civilizations here on this continent did not have a patriarchal nuclear family structure. There was communities that are matrilineal and continue to be matrilineal, even though they're not recognized by the state. This is true whether you're Pueblo, Muskogee Creek, Cherokee, Dene, Navajo, Zapotec, et cetera. There's communities where what would be transgender people historically or two-spirit people were not the victims of hate crimes and microaggressions and full-on physical, in some cases, fatal assaults, right? And so, I was wondering if we could, I guess, talk a little bit about decolonization, resistance, and also how gender and the performance of gender can also be part of that impetus, if you will. So I don't know who would like to start. Perhaps we'll continue, maybe start with the anti-Black racism a little bit, if that's comfortable.
Yeah.
So.
Decolonization is a great word because there are many lineages of talking about decolonization, and so it's a fruitful place to come together. Natalie, I'll be interested to hear what your lineage is. My training is in Chicana feminist thought, and so my lineage of thinking about decolonization comes from U.S. women of color feminisms, which is not not incompatible, but a separate lineage than many Latin American conversations about decolonization. So I bring that up because I do transnational work, and oftentimes that same word can mean different, I think compatible, but different things. So in the lineage that I was trained in, US women of color feminisms and Chicana feminism in particular, decolonization is a lot about doing the internal work to match the external activism. So that is, if we have inherited through 500 years of colonization a hatred of the black body, then decolonization for us looks like learning to love the black body and learning to undo those harmful inner monologues that we in the Caribbean have been taught. And along with that, in that lineage, is the external work of literal decolonization in terms of land. And I think when we're talking about land, that's where I think the lineage of Chicana feminists intersects and has built off of and borrowed from the work of Native feminists that I think, for me, have had a sort of more nuanced way of thinking about land as a decolonial project as well.
So in terms of decolonization and gender and race, I think it'd be helpful for us to just start with what is white supremacy, how is it supported, how does it operate, and how does it perpetuate? And if we think that it has multiple pillars, right, it relies on, there's a scholar, Andrea Smith, that argued it relies on three things: genocide, slaveability, and incarceration, right? And so those that get caught up in the settler colonial project in the US and beyond are essentially either enslaved, and this has been directed, and that's where anti-blackness operates, because we have to understand that racialization is a means to an end. It's a method. It helps us do something, right? The end result is to essentially objectify peoples and bodies in order to dispossess them. So slaveability is often directed towards anti-blackness in order to extract labor, right? Free labor. Genocide is directed at indigenous peoples in order to dispossess them of their land. So not only just physical genocide, but cultural genocide, right? So we think in terms of even blood quantum, right? There's a debate in Native country around who's Native based on blood quantum. Well, this is a system that's imposed by the US, right? By the Bureau of Indian Affairs, by the institution, in order to essentially be a logic of elimination. If you can incrementally eliminate indigenous peoples, then you can disappear their rights and claims to land. And then you have incarceration. Well, what does incarceration do? It helps you manage unruly populations, populations that are agitating for rights, rights to vote, agitating to protect their land. And I think in terms of, so if we look at the current ICE project, right, ICE, and how it's directed along the US-Mexico border, we can see that all these factors are actually operating, right? And there's a intense racism, the anti-Black discourse of essentially assigning negative characteristics, inherent violence, inherent criminal behavior to Mexican/Latinx peoples operates there. Genocide essentially operates by thinking in terms of these communities as a foreign threat, a contagion. Well, again, they're not a foreign threat because they're indigenous to the Americas, but they're a threat to, it was framed by, I think, Steve Bannon as an existential threat. So they're a threat to white civility, white civilization, because they exist in a different metaphysical reality, one that is not necessarily driven by capitalism and that seeks to actually develop alternatives to capitalism. So in that sense, they exist as a threat, right? And so incarceration, when you are able to essentially criminalize folks and incarcerate them, and they become a commodity that produces capital to maintain white supremacy. So it's a perfect, ICE is a perfect construct of white supremacy. It's a perfect outcome because it continues to perpetuate that equation.
Yeah, and thanks for bringing the other issue, which is mass incarceration. The private prison industrial complex has been pretty much the #1 growth industry since the mid-1980s. So if you're a capitalist and just interested in making money, regardless of kind of any ethical concerns, if you invested in stock in the late 80s, early 90s, you're probably going to make a lot of money by now. And one of the things that I particularly find really outrageous about the corrections, Colorado is basically a fairly large prison state, and I don't know if everyone's aware of this, but the University of Colorado Boulder, most libraries, most public institutions of learning have a legal contract that they have to buy all of their furniture made by inmates. Most inmates make less than $1 a day, and then a lot of the stuff that's being sold is just exorbitantly high. I mean, like a chair that you could probably buy at Office Max for $50 or $60 is selling for like $350. So there's a phenomenal amount of profit in this, and so every time I teach, I'm always really concerned, how we're perpetuating, if you will, what many scholars call the enslavement of labor. And then, of course, with the most recent and horrifying posturing as well as enforcement through ICE, the detention centers now are becoming this huge growth industry as well. So thanks for mentioning that. So I'm wondering, I guess, to follow up on the question of decoloniality, Dr. Avalos. So how do you see decolonization occurring? Is it really about resisting on all these multiple fronts?
I'm glad that you brought that up again because I realized I was setting up my response and I didn't get to that. So yes, once we understand how these logics are operating, part of what's happening on the ground that's incredible, my work notes that folks are doing, as Kristie says, doing the internal decolonization. What does it mean to actually question the forms of colonial ideology that you've begun to internalize and deeply associate yourself with, right? So we have to understand that Native and Latinx communities have been socialized to believe that they are innately inferior, that they are less intelligent, they are potentially more volatile, right? And this is all about civility discourse. This is why I keep bringing it back to indigeneity. This is about who is a civil person, fully capable of being civilized, and who can never be, who will continually exist in a state of decayed barbarism or primitivism and must be carried by the state, right? And so this discourse is deeply powerful. So a lot of the work of third world women of color feminists, that third wave feminist movement, focuses on reclaiming your identity beyond these discourses, beyond these ideas. But I think it's also really important to think about the material dimensions, as Kristie noted. For Native communities, this is about land and resources, partly because in a settler colonial context, land has been made into a commodity, the most important commodity. This is how wealth has been built. We want to understand how wealth has been built in the first world. Well, through land, through resources. So decolonial projects, I think they're happening in many stages, one of which is regenerating individuals and communities, healing themselves so that they can go on and do the fight, right? Have a more accurate understanding of what the reality is in front of them, learning their true histories, their true identities, partly because even in a US context where we have a multicultural liberal America, or discourse of a liberal America, even though it's really the US, I wasn't raised understanding my own history. I had to go to ethnic studies. I had to go to this other feminist literature as an adolescent to even understand my own history, because they're purposefully erased. If you purposefully erase people's histories and their identities, they are deeply disempowered. So the work of decolonization is interlinked. The ideological is linked to the material. That material fight can really only take place once we have these more ideological discursive shifts.
And I would just add, because my work is on the media, the place of the media in that. So one of the ways that discourses and stereotypes are maintained is, of course, through the media. And in the US at this point, there is essentially no independent media, which is not to say that individuals aren't funding through Kickstarters and making their own films. They are, but the distribution channels for media are controlled by about 7 companies, and even our favorite media companies, our favorite alternative media companies, are ultimately owned by a larger conglomerate. So what this means is that very few people get to make decisions about how a much larger group of people get portrayed. In the Latinx case right now, we have, I would say, actually an increasing amount of Latinx representation on television, which is a good thing. And those representations are coming out primarily of Netflix and ABC, are the two sort of platforms that are kind of pushing this. The issue is that ABC, with its links with Disney as well, is run by white men. That's just a fact. That's not an opinion. So when a young writer, Latinx writer, pitches a television show, and say the first round of execs say yes, they still have to go up and up and up and up. So what we're getting are increasingly shows about gang members and Latina women being depicted as maids. And when we get things like, say, the TV show Vida on, I think, Stars, which has a really, I think, profound depiction of queer Latina and Latinx life, that's almost a miracle, because there is no money to make that happen. And even if there were money to make that happen, there are no platforms to widely distribute those things. So we see the rise of things like YouTube shows, for example, with YouTube being, for all of its problems, still a relatively democratic platform in that you can upload things yourself without going through a middle person. So I would just add that the media is incredibly tightly controlled, and it is very hard for a culture to reform its beliefs on a group of people if it's consistently being fed these same discourses that have been around since the good neighbor policy and the dawn of the film industry in the US.
Thank you. So just to perhaps wrap up some of these really phenomenal comments and insights and then open it up for discussion. Yeah, I mean, the way I'm thinking about decolonization is also really about just shifting education from K through 12. I recently read that the state of Oregon has actually passed by legislation to mandate the teaching of ethnic studies in K through 12, because as a professor in the Department of Ethnic Studies, every semester when I teach undergraduates, I always get the same response. Why haven't I ever been exposed to these materials before? Why did I have to be a junior in college to actually learn something that's relevant to my sense of community, history, that I can talk to my family? And then for the non-students of color that are in ethnic studies classes are like, wow, I did not know this. I grew up in, my best friend's Latinx or but I didn't know any of these histories. And so part of it, in addition to media and providing spaces for much more empowering depictions, more representations, rather than just tired, sexist and racist tropes and homophobic tropes. It's also about shifting the ways in which education as a whole functions. And when there have been ethnic studies types of classes or programs in K through 12, all of a sudden kids are excited about school. The quote unquote dropout rate, I hate that word, push out rate for Latino students, for example, shifts dramatically, as well as other students of color. So it's an ongoing, complex process, and as these two phenomenal scholars have noted, and a lot of it, I think we can absolutely learn from women of color theorists, Chicana feminist theorists, indigenous feminist theorists, the queer of color critique, to really think about power, representation, inclusivity, and empowerment. So I'll leave it at that, and then we'll go ahead and open it up for discussions and question and answer. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Big round of applause for our guests. And before we do the Q&A, if you could bear with me at the end, I would like to thank our sponsors, and it's a long list. If you could stay in the room until I'm done reading that, that would be wonderful. Thank you very much. Keep your questions short. And who is the first one?
I'm trying to put my thoughts together here, but the global power structure, I think is the word you used, has been fomenting racism among the 99% since before the country became a country. What reason do we have to believe that that can change?
Audience can answer that question.
So that's a really good question, and I think that there are times in which, in my father's generation, he really believed that it wouldn't. We had this conversation, and we would argue about it, where he would say things like, well, the U.S. will live and die racist, meaning as a Native person, he knew that the U.S. itself as a project was temporary. I think from a Native perspective, you will continue beyond as people and this long past this project, right? But that the project itself that's what it's built on. And so I think it actually, we're at a moment where we have to envision an entirely different project. And that's really what decolonization allows us to do as well, is imagine. And to think in terms of, and I think one of the fears or some confusion, because I've had students say in class when I'm talking about decolonization, worry that, does that mean that people of color will be in power and whites will be marginalized and oppressed? And I think that fear comes from assuming that power only operates in a top-down hierarchical way. And we've just been so socialized to believe that this kind of white supremacist, patriarchal, and heteronormative order, that's the only model of power that can exist. And so if we collectively think beyond, and I think that's the work, right? Because we can't do it alone. We need all the allies that we can get in order to think through what an entirely different project, equitable project, looks like. How might it serve all of us, right? And one that centers land, not just because land's an important commodity, but instead because land is sentient, because the land itself is suffering deeply. And maybe if we rethink our role, this is what has been so beautiful about some of the Native activism that's at least finally hit more of a international media in the last few years, is we can think of ourselves as stewards again, right? And that changes our understanding of citizenship or our relation to one another, as opposed to thinking of ourselves in terms of citizens in a nation where we have rights, we might think of ourselves as peoples that are existing on land that needs to be cared for. What are our responsibilities to it and to others? Right? Yeah.
Hello. How is it that white supremacy, European supremacy, if we think in the historical context, has persisted for centuries and centuries across what we now know to be longer than the lifespan of individual human beings? From your viewpoint, the way your work is going, how does that process work? How does that replication of those structures you're talking about happen past any individual's lifetime?
Wealth. Yeah, wealth is passed down. So wealth, power belongs to those that have wealth, not those that have money, not those that make good paychecks, those that have wealth. So we sitting here right now, which to the question of why should we believe that it's going to change, because this right here is a miracle. Where we all came from, this is a miracle that we got PhDs and are sitting here right now. We are the only people, I'm putting words from what I know from both of you, we are some of the only people in our communities that have been able to get PhDs and get tenure track jobs. So this is an example of the activism that our peoples have been doing so that we can be here now. So now we're in a position where we have stable jobs for the first time in our community's histories, right? We are the first ones to have stable jobs. So our kids will have like a little something, and then their kids will have like a little something more. And at some point, they may have wealth. And that's when things change. And it's not that money is the most important thing, but in a capitalist system, wealth equals power. So even if Arturo becomes president of the university, Arturo still does not have wealth in the same way that, the current president of the university, Mark. Right. Yeah, does. So I think among all these other projects of decolonization is either reforming the capitalist system or we're going to have to get some wealth, because you simply cannot have power within this system by making a good paycheck in one generation.
I'd like to add that I think it's really ideology as well. You need that wealth to maintain power. You need the consolidation of wealth. And for multiple nations to essentially be working in coalition with one another, maybe we could say conspiring with one another to accumulate wealth at the detriment of the rest of the population, right? So you essentially have a first world, third world dynamic that exists internationally. And the ideology is one of a racial hierarchy that depends on social, cultural, evolutionary theory, right? This is an idea that started percolating in the 1700s. It really became part of our everyday notion of what is real. It kind of like, it comes out of race science from the 19th century. The idea that there are primitive peoples, that there are barbaric peoples, there are civilized people, and this is an innate state, and that it's a static state, that people might slowly evolve and shift towards civility, but it's totally contingent on whiteness, right? And so this hierarchy also, as a religious studies scholar, it also maps onto religion. So if you can say, well, it's white Christians that are living in this pinnacle of moral, ethical, economic, and artistic civility, then it's all others, racially, religiously, that fall into a category below. And we've all deeply internalized this. And it's become so naturalized, and that's part of the work of decolonization, is to denaturalize that ideology. Yeah.
Thank you. Perhaps phenomenal questions. I don't know how you all felt watching or being part of the very much youth-led protest in the last few days, right? Spurned by a young Swedish, I think she's 15, 16-year-old Greta Thunberg or something like that. But anyway, it's just really, really exciting to see youth on a global stage actually beginning to think about their desires, rights, and kind of the future they want to have. And so it's really, really a phenomenal moment in terms of, I mean, I was seeing like elementary school kids going out and protesting. I mean, that's to me just this kind of politicization or conscientization, and these, you know, a lot of people complain about the millennials are super entitled, they want everything by app, you press an app and you get what you want, and so on and so forth. But maybe part of that desire of getting what you want is also driving this kind of desire for a more healthy and safe world. A lot of people, you know, if you listen to Trump's discourse of the demonization of Latinx folks, you know, it's a way to kind of deflect the fact that the United States is becoming very, very what scholars and activists call the Browning of America, right? You know, as children start kind of growing to voting ages, the demographic shifts. Currently, there's around 70 million Latinx folks in the United States today, about 55, 60 million folks of African descent, African American folks, about 10% of the population, 9.5 are of Asian American descent. So there's this, you know, slowly but surely, the United States is becoming much more diverse. And I think as these demographic shifts continue, and especially if children are feeling empowered and excited about their future, then perhaps as they enter into the, you know, democratic process, hopefully those desires to have a more just and empowering world will result in the kind of election, you know. And all the elected politicians now should be really paying attention to what these young kids are saying, because in a few years, these young kids are gonna vote, right? And if you're still very much in these very entrenched, patriarchal, Eurocentric, corporate-driven kind of political agendas, your political career is probably gonna in theory, not that be long, unless you just go into the extreme white supremacist fringes, which will probably always stay that way as a kind of how they consider themselves to resist this encroachment of threats, I guess, to the biopower of white supremacy in today's political moment.
So I'm sorry to interrupt this wonderful conversation, but we have to almost wrap up. There is a gentleman here who would like to make a comment, and then we're going to have to wrap up. Thank you.
I would like to thank you for this session, and I say it as my wife and I are the people who persuaded Jaipur Literature Festival to come to Colorado, and have been working for the last decade with Teamwork Arts to do this. It's been very important of us to reach out and to try and make this a conversation that includes not just the wonderful voices from South Asia that we're hearing, but also the voices from this place too. And my wife, who's the executive director of the festival, but who's not able to be here at the moment because she's doing what an executive director does at this time, but would have loved to be here. She worked extremely hard to set this session up for months, and if she were here, she would be very deeply moved by it, and she would want to thank you, Soares, her husband, who do a little more than make the coffee and drive her to meetings and so forth. Would like to thank you on behalf of her and I think everyone else. If I may, with one last 5 seconds, just put out a question that we probably don't have to answer right now, which is as someone who's spent my 50 years as a scholar working with Tibetan people, studying their language and literature, living with them in India and Nepal, not Tibet because I can't get in, and trying to think about these same questions, I've been fascinated by your questioning this notion, interrogating this notion of race at all, and introducing this word of racialization. And I'd just like to put the question out, even if we don't have time to answer it, because the longer I think about it, the less sense the idea itself makes to me. It strikes me that race per se is a racist notion. And I'd love to hear you all talk about this, but we're probably out of time. But that means we'll have to invite you back to talk about it next time. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This is indeed a conversation that needs to be repeated over and over again until us white people get it. So sorry, that was a personal comment. Jaipur is not responsible, but. So really quickly, I would like to thank our festival sponsors and partners, and please bear with me, I'm gonna read a list. But Z Entertainment, Boulder Library Foundation, City of Boulder, Boulder Public Library, the National Endowment for the Arts, Motwani Jadeja Foundation, Tampa Bay Literary Society, Organic India, Anchor Point Foundation, Bhakti Chai, Colorado Creative Industries, Consulate General of Canada in Denver, Community Foundation serving Boulder County, Shambhala Publications, Highland City Club, Hilton Garden Hotel Boulder, CBS 4 Denver, Brock Media, KGNU, Denver Post, Daily Camera, Boulder Weekly, CPR, Boulder Bookstore, America's Latino Eco Festival, BMOCA, Boddicker Theater and Dairy Arts Center, Boulder Chamber of Commerce, Boulder County Arts Alliance, Boulder International Film Festival, Boulder Oli, Boulder Rotary Peace Builders, Boulder Valley School District, Boulder Writers Alliance, Center for Asian Studies, CU Boulder, Colorado Talking Book Library, Dean of Arts and Sciences, CU Boulder, EcoCycle, Eldorado Water, E-Town, Honest Tea, I Have a Dream Foundation Boulder, International Business Circle, Lighthouse Writers Workshop, Kim and Jake's Bakery, Lucky's Market. I'm almost done. Maya's Production, Ozo Coffee, Right Relationship, Titulia, Tibet Kitchen, and Multimedia Audiovisual. Thank you, and thank you very much. Thank you to Kristie Soares, Natalie Alvarez, and Arturo Aldama. Thank you.